Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. SoupX, the Startup Expo, North America's premier startup conference, is March 6th and 7th, 2017, in sunny Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Affordably priced, SoupX is a 2-day international conference featuring workshops, panels, speeches, a $50,000 startup competition, and over 100 exhibitors. For more information, go to sup-x.org. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Mark Volchek. He's an entrepreneur, investor, and advisor. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. You're doing some really interesting things, and you've been involved in a bunch of really interesting things. But maybe before we kind of get into that, let's start off with getting to know you a little bit better and cover where you grew up.
Sure. So my early childhood I spent in New York and Long Island area.
Okay.
And then I lived, so that till about 10 years old. And then I lived in Europe from 10 to 18, so in Austria specifically.
Nice.
Before coming back to the States to go to college in Connecticut.
Sure. So what was it like living in Europe, being kind of an American living over there?
It was certainly a big change, but it was very interesting sort of in hindsight. I think as a kid, you really just don't think that much about it. My mother is originally from Austria, so she basically for her was, going home. And
Sure.
So it was an opportunity for me to learn a second language and sort of get exposed to a completely different, culture and way of doing business. And I think today, in hindsight, it's sort of a really interesting sort of experience. I can sort of look back on and understand many things from a different perspective, having spent, those years in Europe.
Sure. No, that makes sense. So you went to Yale and took economics, correct?
Yep, that's right.
So what got you interested in kind of economics, and why did you decide to pursue that in university?
So I was pretty set on going into sort of business, whatever that meant,
Sure.
at the time. And so economics was sort of the closest in sort of the liberal arts, arena to sort of business, because Yale at the time had a, very small business school. There was no undergraduate business program. So economics was sort of a way to learn how sort of the business world works, how the economy works, and sort of, gave me a lot of the fundamental things needed to really be able to, understand business later. Because ultimately, having a strong math background, having some of the economics background, it's helpful when you think about, what makes the business world, operate and function and what makes it successful.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So you graduated from Yale. You worked on a bachelor's degree, and then you got your master's, correct?
Yep. Yeah, I actually did that concurrently. So.
Okay.
So I did sort of a joint program in 4 years where I was able to get my bachelor's and my master's by taking more advanced classes kind of earlier in my undergraduate career. So I was fortunate that I was able to sort of get all that done in 4 years.
Sure. That you must have been busy.
Yep. Yeah, and there was lots of ways to sort of cross-utilize the credits between graduate and undergraduate programs. So that was a pretty unique aspect of the program that Yale had at the time.
Sure. No, that's great. So you graduate. You were actually an entrepreneur before you kind of became a VC, correct?
Yep, that's right.
So walk me through kind of your entrepreneurial career.
Yeah, so, during college, I was already sort of active as an entrepreneur, and I sort of had a home improvement business associated with College Pro. I don't know if you know, they sort of do college franchises, and so I was involved in that for a few years during the summers and in my free time, and was able to, learn how to run a basic business, hire people, make sales, deliver the services to the customers and everything that went with that. So customer service, all the important pieces of one day running a business, I learned, I think, on that small scale. And then in 1999, I met Sean and Miles, who were, down the road going to be my co-founders of Hire One. But we actually started the Yale Entrepreneurial Society in the summer of 1999 to try to encourage students to think about starting businesses. And something that at the time, Yale was really behind some of the other colleges that had business plan competitions and entrepreneurial programs, and Yale did not at the time. So the Yale Entrepreneurial Society that we started in 99 was sort of the first, path for that. And that's really where I met my two co-founders, where 6 months later, in the winter of 2000, we really started Hire One, which was a company focused on providing basically back office efficiencies to colleges and universities and enabling students to transact more effectively with the school and get their financial aid dollars more quickly.
Sure. No, that's great. And then you ran that for a long time, like a couple decades, correct?
I guess 14 years. So we started that in March of 2000, and I left the company officially in May of 2014. So a little bit over 14 years.
Sure.
And we really took it from the three founders to being a public company on the New York Stock Exchange.
Wow. So kind of walk me through that process. Like, how did you grow a company from, 3 employees to kind of, IPOing?
Yeah, it's sort of, one step at a time. And I always think about it as, being an entrepreneur is really bringing resources together. That ultimately is the most important thing you can do. And that starts from, the people you bring onto the team. So I think, early on, we brought some really good people onto the team. We raised capital, which is another, resource that needs to go into building a company. And then ultimately, we built a great product. We got lots of customers to use it. And one thing sort of led to the next, and we continued to raise more capital to grow the business. Ultimately, in 2008, we raised some private equity capital to buy out some of our early investors who were looking for liquidity. And that allowed us to grow the company even more. And then in 2010, the time seemed right, and we went public.
Interesting. So what made you decide to go public?
So, part of that decision was certainly with the private equity firm. So, the private equity firm that invested in 2008, in this case, Lightyear Capital, they thought that going public was a good way for them to eventually get liquidity. Right. Because the actual IPO process really doesn't create liquidity for everybody overnight, because we all know there are lockup periods and there's restrictions on selling. But it sort of does create a path towards liquidity. And so, being public also enables you to get cheaper access to capital, even though we didn't need capital. It was sort of, it gives you a currency to do M&A, and we had been somewhat active doing acquisitions, and we believed that was another platform that would help, being public.
Sure. No, that makes some sense. So you left in 2014. What did you kind of do after that?
So my goal was really to take a little bit of time off, which I think is really a great thing. If you have an opportunity to take time off, particularly after having done 14 years building a company and being an entrepreneur is sort of a 24/7 commitment.
Sure. Yep.
Even though I did travel and took vacation, you're really never offline, especially given technology today. No matter where you are, I was checking email, I was responding to things, and so I really did need a break. And so my goal was to take about a year off, and I bought a sailboat and went sailing for a year. So from kind of summer of 2014 to the summer of 2015, I kind of sailed around the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. And I would always come back in between because I was still on some boards and had some responsibilities that I had to take care of. So I would spend a few weeks on the boat and then fly back, spend
awesome.
A few weeks at my home in Florida. But my goal was really to get involved in the startup ecosystem down here in South Florida and see what was going on down here. It was certainly a lot more nascent than, say, developed systems like in New York or Boston or the Valley. But there was a lot of activity here in Miami and in South Florida. And so that's what I started exploring kind of in that 2014, 2015 time frame.
Sure. Well, and just like obviously you mentioned like you had some other like you had a bunch of connections down there too, right? So it makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, the boat ride from kind of Florida to the Bahamas like 3 hours or something, I heard. Is that true?
Yeah, by sailboat, it's probably a little bit more. The
Okay.
closest point is about 40 miles.
Okay.
So, on the sailboat, I was doing 6 to 8 knots, so that can take you all day,
Okay.
depending on how you do it.
Sure,
But on
sure.
a speedboat, you can do it in 2 hours probably, from
Okay.
Miami over to Bimini. But the Bahamas is a huge
Sure.
system of islands. I think almost 400 miles long. So there's a
Wow.
lot, many islands to explore, and it was a really cool experience.
Sure, I can imagine that must have been great just to kind of, well, obviously when you're out at sea, like you're not connected to the internet at all, right? At least for parts of it, for sure.
Not when you're not when you're between islands, but
Sure.
as you sort of spend time on the sailboat, you find ways to get Wi-Fi and you find different places to connect. So the more time I spent on the boat, the better I got at finding ways to get a little bit of internet and at least stay somewhat connected. But you're certainly not constantly connected as you would be, elsewhere.
Sure. No, that's great. Like I always love that when you can just disconnect, even if it's for like a week or even a couple of days, right? That I think it's healthy, and it's sometimes I start to miss it after a couple of days, but I try to do it, maybe a couple times a year for a day or two. So I get that.
Right.
So at what point did you decide to kind of start a venture company?
Right. So that was really came out of our angel investing activity. So Dean, who was one of my partners at Hire One, we had been doing angel investing since 2008. And so we really liked angel investing. At first, we did it really to help out entrepreneurs and, to learn from investing. And then we tried to make that more formal. So we really were looking for, the best investments, and we did a little bit more due diligence. And so as we sort of, moved our attention to Florida, we were thinking about how we can sort of formalize that angel investing and how do we make that more impactful for the ecosystem. And what we ultimately discovered was that there is sort of a lot of angel investing going on in South Florida,
Okay.
but there's no sort of organized professional sort of venture capital firm focused on kind of the Series A type investments. And so we feel like that's sort of a market niche that currently nobody is filling. And we thought we could be more impactful by writing bigger checks. And certainly you can make it sort of a full-time role by raising a fund. So that's kind of where we came out from, where we started from angel investing to starting the fund. The other driving force was that we met Paul Tanner, who's now one of my partners in the venture fund as well. And he's a wealth manager, and many of his clients were interested in participating in the startup ecosystem, but weren't really sure how to make those angel investments in a responsible way that would actually lead to good returns.
Sure.
So they were looking for, help with angel investing. And so we said, well, having a fund is sort of the best way to help, folks participate in that startup ecosystem without the work or the worry of, having to decide what investments to make and then track them. So it's really interesting, as we sort of were studying why people wanted to do angel investing. There's many reasons. And so, many folks want to do angel investing to be involved and help support the ecosystem. And by investing in a fund, I think, that's even more impactful because we can really help that ecosystem. We have full-time associate with four partners that are all working to help the companies we invest in. But we also do a lot of other things in the community to create sort of that glue that ultimately builds the ecosystem so that more entrepreneurs can start companies, to make it easier for them to raise capital. Certainly we can't invest in every startup. We're looking to only invest in maybe 3 or 4 per year. But we want to be there as a resource to help folks find maybe other sources of funding, connect them with other folks that might be interested. And we think that's part of the role we play as being sort of a South Florida-based venture fund. We're not solely focused on Florida. We also look at deals in other sort of underserved markets or underserved sectors. But being based in South Florida, we certainly want to contribute to the ecosystem down here and help build that and see that grow.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And I love the fact that you're like kind of involved in the community, because you're the director of the Fort Lauderdale Boca Raton Founder Institute, correct?
Right, exactly. And we actually just merged that with the South Miami chapter to create the South Florida chapter. So now we actually have a Founder Institute South Florida, which is overarching kind of from Boca all the way down to Miami. And I'm a director of that chapter now with two other guys. So that's another really interesting program that I got involved in, and I think is really interesting, particularly for places like South Florida where there aren't as many established sort of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial sort of paths. It gives people who have an idea sort of a roadmap and a 14-week program to go from idea to actually starting their business and really getting it going. Not just talking about starting a business, but actually doing it. And so I think that's why that's a really cool program, and I'm very committed to that Founder Institute.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then potentially you could get some deals out of it, maybe not, but it doesn't help to be connected, right?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think everybody in, that does investing or is sort of involved in the startup ecosystem has a vested interest in growing the number of startups and making it easier for folks to start businesses and to raise capital. And so I do think that Founder Institute is part of that. We hope that, we helped, last semester, I think 10 folks graduated, the time before about 10.
Wow.
So we hope that means, 10 or 20 new companies every year. And again, that's a small piece of the pie, but it's another piece. And,
sure,
all the pieces are necessary to build the whole ecosystem.
No, that's great. So I kind of want to dive a bit deeper into what kind of companies do you guys invest in, and is there kind of a rough range that you guys kind of invest? Like how much capital do you normally put into a company? I get it really depends, but is there kind of a broad range that you guys typically look at?
Sure. So first, talking about stage. So generally, we look for companies that have revenue, ideally have sort of $1 million annual run rate of revenue.
Okay.
So there's flexibility there, but ideally we're looking for, a sort of proof of concept being done so that there's real customers and the company's really trying to scale that. So that's kind of from a stage perspective what we're looking at. So it's not a total startup. It's not someone with an idea or it's just a product. We want somebody with a product that's working and customers actually using it and paying for it. So that's kind of from a stage perspective. Ideally, we look to invest between $250,000 and $1 million in terms of an initial investment.
Okay.
And then we reserve significant additional capital to support the company after that, because one of the biggest risks for companies is follow-on funding risk. And particularly in South Florida, where there's limited options for follow-on funding, we want to make sure we reserve significant funding for those companies that are doing well and need additional capital to grow. So that's kind of our goal there. But the initial check, we generally will not go below $250,000, and we generally don't want to go over $1 million. So that's kind of the target range in terms of dollar amount.
Got you. Okay. So what types of industries do you guys prefer, or does it really matter? Like, I'm kind of looking at your website, kind of just, looking up on you guys a bit. You seem to be doing a bunch of stuff in kind of the healthcare space.
Sure. So we do sort of focus on specific sectors, even though we will look at any type of company. Sure. Given our background and experience, we generally like B2B companies. So we can understand and evaluate companies better whose customers are businesses, and where there's a direct sale and there's a sort of a sales force. And we think, just given our backgrounds, that we feel very comfortable with those types of businesses, and we can assess the pipeline, and we'd like to see that kind of information. That said, specific sectors that we like, and again, that's given, what we know and where we think we can add value,
sure,
is financial technology, education technology, and then more generally sort of tech-enabled services for businesses, enterprise SaaS, which is very similar, so anything that makes sort of an enterprise more efficient using software. And then the last sector is digital healthcare, which we think is just a huge, problem for our society as, folks live much longer, and we need to find ways to provide healthcare in a much more efficient way and in a more proactive way. And so one of our first portfolio companies actually uses data to try to predict potential health issues at a very, very early stage based on behaviors. And then they can sort of send somebody to check on an elderly patient before it becomes a real issue. So that company is called Care Predict, and it's a great company based right here in Broward County in South Florida. So they're a great example of that.
So walk me through that a little bit. Like, do they have to wear like a band, or like how do you guys do, or how do they do that?
Yeah, so the Care Predict client is the assisted living facility.
Okay.
So they basically sell them a whole system, and it does include a wearable. So each resident of the facility will wear basically on their primary hand or arm, they will wear sort of a small wearable device, similar to what a Fitbit might look like.
Sure.
But it's very different. It collects all kinds of data, but similar, it collects movement, it collects humidity, it sort of collects as much ambient data as it can, and it also works with beacons that are installed in every room so that it knows what room and what behavior people were doing. And therefore, it can sort of evaluate, are people brushing their teeth? How often do you go to the bathroom? So, for example, if you normally would go twice in a night and now you're going 5 times, that may be sort of a sign of, a potential health issue that could be, quickly solved if you catch it early versus, if it becomes a full-blown infection that might require a hospital visit, which is very costly and unnecessary. So that's the kind of data they're collecting. And they're basically looking for patterns within that data or things that could be indications that someone has a health issue.
Okay, and then they the nurses or the staff on call get kind of a notification saying you might want to go check on this resident?
Exactly. So they have a system that essentially, it's web-based, and they basically just get an alert, and then they can send somebody. They can also, with the system, find residents, for example, if their doctor's waiting for them in the lobby, and some of these facilities can be really big, and so there's lots of other features. But it's basically a business-to-business solution for that assisted living facility. That's kind of how we think of it, but it solves a real issue, it solves real problem, and that's what we liked about that.
I got you. Okay, so maybe you guys have kind of done a bunch of really interesting kind of investments. So do you maybe want to cover a couple other companies that you're either pretty passionate about or that are doing really well that you guys have invested in the last little while?
Sure. So in the actual fund, we currently have 2 companies. So many of the other companies were sort of from let's call this venture capital. So why don't I tell you about the second company in our portfolio, which I think is really exciting. And it's called Lending Front, and it's actually based in New York. And they focus on software that makes it sort of easier and less costly to provide small businesses with loans. So it's a big problem today that small business lending has become more and more difficult for banks and for other folks to do profitably. So Lending Front has created a software solution that essentially, helps do everything from the application management to capturing all the data to decisioning the loan to managing the loan and then monitoring the loan. And by having that all in one system, it can drive down the cost, for the lender, which then, increases profitability and allows them to make more loans than they would normally be able to. So it's a really interesting company. This one's a little bit earlier. They're still, they do have a few beta clients, but they're sort of still developing a product and looking to grow as well. So similar to when we invested in Care Predict, they had 2 beta clients running, Now they have sort of 11 that they're working on, and lending fund very similar. They had a few when we invested in, in this lending fund we invested about 9 months ago, and now they've grown that as well. So those are generally the profile of companies we look for. And then there's sort of the general criteria that, you would hear from any investors. We look for experience, management, who have experience in the sector and the business that they're trying to start. And a lot of it is about evaluating and judging the management team is, can they pull it off? Because ultimately that's the real question. Most financial models show huge success. I've almost never seen one that shows that it wasn't going to be great, right? So the job of investors to evaluate is, can the management team pull off whatever business plan they're proposing to do? Sure. And that's ultimately, what we focus a lot on is, who is the management and what will it really take to be successful?
Sure.
What do they have to achieve to get there?
But I also think that the fact that you and your founders have been through it kind of on the entrepreneurial side really, really helps you guys probably distinguish what's doable or not doable, right? That's got to be a huge selling feature for you guys, and kind of, in a lot of ways, kind of what could set you guys apart from a lot of other kind of VC firms across North America, at least in my opinion.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a great point you bring up. I think there's sort of two sides to that. I think actually three sides to that. One, I think we can, evaluate sort of the feasibility of the business concept, particularly in businesses that are close to what we have experience in. So these kinds of B2B, enterprise type businesses. So I think in terms of evaluating, I think we have a real advantage with those types of companies. Then I think once we're an investor, we can be more helpful, not only because of what we know and our experience, but also with contacts, hiring. So we know a lot of folks in the industry. We can say, well, this is a great person that we used to work with here or there. And so that is another piece. We don't want to just write a check and, hope that, eventually we make a return. We want to write a check and to be an active part of the board, an active part of helping companies solve the difficult issues as they grow.
Sure.
And then I think the third part of sort of investing, which I think is sometimes a little bit counterintuitive, is that it's somewhat of a selection issue, that the best companies often have a choice of where they can, get their capital from.
Sure.
And so by being entrepreneurs, we think we have a leg up on entrepreneurs wanting to work with us, we hope, and that will give us access to the best deals or the better deals, because that ultimately, even if you were perfect at evaluating which companies were going to be successful and which weren't, having access to the best deals is how the top VCs in the Valley and in other places can be so successful and create such great returns from their investors, is by having that access. And so we're building that, reputation and through our contacts and through our first few investments, because we think that's really, really important, is not only to evaluate the companies and then help the companies, but also to be sort of that top choice for those entrepreneurs that we want to back.
No, I think it's like, I think like until you've gone through it, you don't really know what to expect, right? And I think just being able to have people like yourself that have invested in something. So not only do you want, like, just hypothetically, like if you invested in a company I'm working on, you have obviously want to give me good advice. You can give me that good advice because you've been through it. And, where somebody like myself might have not been through it, right? And so I think the thing that I find funny sometimes when I've had other kind of venture capitalists either on the show or just talk to them, it's interesting because you can clearly tell the ones that have been through it before and the ones that haven't. And I'm not saying necessarily maybe one's better than the other, because sometimes you want one over the other. But at least for like, especially when you're a tech founder, you want to be working with somebody that's been through it, because, like something as simple as like, how do I solve this payroll issue? Or how do I solve this issue? Or, right? Like if you've been through that, then you can recommend something where it might not take me, hours or days or weeks or spend a bunch of capital just kind of trying to figure it out, right? Just you quickly pick up the phone and say like, what do you think of this? And then if you don't know, you just say like, well, I know so-and-so dealt with this, right? So I think that's really valuable. And in some cases, it could be just as valuable as the actual capital that you put in, if not more in some cases.
Yeah, that's certainly right. And I think as the company gets bigger and bigger and potentially looks at, an exit through M&A or possibly an IPO, those are things that really are pretty unique sort of experiences and skills. And so I think we have that. And so we do hope that many of our companies will have a big successful exit. And how to navigate that is really, really difficult. And I wish we had even better advice. We had great advisors, but it's sort of an area that you can never have sort of enough advice because it's something that most entrepreneurs have never done. And so when you're in the fortunate situation to be there, being able to maximize sort of the returns for investors and for yourself is really, really important. And a lot of that comes down to having the right contacts at the right firms to allow you to sort of have that best exit at the right time in the right place. It's a very, it's a singular event for the company many times. And so it's really, really important. So I think we can give advice, all the way from the beginning of how to start all the way through that life cycle, which I think is pretty unique.
No, and that was actually, it's funny you mentioned that because that was going to be my next question to you. Can you kind of walk me through your guys' process from actually like, okay, like I apply, what's your kind of due diligence process? And then let's kind of walk me through how you work with a company once you decide what they're going to do. And then how do you decide whether you should sell them off, IPO? Like, walk me through that kind of whole process.
Sure. So, from the really, beginning, people, send us information all the time on their companies.
Okay.
And we generally do a scan pretty quickly to see, is it in a sector that we like? Is it the right stage? So most companies get screened out just numerically. They either are pre-revenue or they're in a sector that we just aren't interested in investing in because we have no experience and no way to help folks. And so if the information we get, and we get it through the website, but a lot of it's through referrals or people meet me at, I speak very regularly, probably once a week at an event down here in South Florida. And so I feel I try to be very accessible. And so we get a lot of those business plans. And so once it passes sort of the screen in terms of stage, in terms of industry, and somebody on our team would like to sort of take it to the next step. So it really only requires one of the partners or our associate. If someone really likes it, they will take that sort of first phone call with the entrepreneur, usually about 30 minutes, just to learn more and make sure, that, everything lines up, that it really is interesting. If the company passes that stage, then we'll do an in-person meeting with sort of as much of our team internally and the entrepreneur and maybe a few people on their team to have that sort of initial meeting to tell us about the business, answer a bunch of questions. And generally, we'll send questions sort of along the way. And part of our due diligence process, which we think is really interesting and important, is to see how the entrepreneur responds to those questions. How quickly, how detailed, how thoughtful, is the entrepreneur sort of listening or is the entrepreneur defensive? Sometimes, we'll ask questions and, we really just don't know, or sometimes we are skeptical and we ask sort of leading questions because we have a concern. But how people react to that is really, really important because we want to be, helpful, and we want to be giving advice and help companies for many years to come. And, how entrepreneurs take that advice or take those questions and how thoughtful they are is a really important part of that process along the way. But the formal process, sort of an in-person meeting, after that, we'll generally focus on 3 or 4 areas we think are sort of the, high risk or concern areas for us. If we like the business, we'll sort of focus on 3 or 4 things. And then we'll focus our due diligence on those 3 or 4 areas. So we'll ask the entrepreneur, as much detail about those things as we can, and then see if we can sort of resolve those concerns. And ultimately, if we sort of get through that process, we'll generally start talking about terms. We'll put out a non-binding term sheet And if we agree on terms, then we'll do what we call sort of confirmatory due diligence, which is a lot of work, because we'll ask lots for us and for the entrepreneur, because we'll ask lots of questions on financials, on legal, on lots and lots of things. And ideally, if we don't discover anything new or any surprises, that should get done in a few weeks, and then we can, proceed with the investment. So that's kind of the process that we take. And as you can imagine, there's lots of sort of things along the way. Because ultimately, investing is making assessments on, as we talked about, the team, and that's really an interpersonal thing. There's no black or white. It's really about evaluating, can this person execute on the plan that they've proposed, right? So
Sure.
There's no easy way, there's no numerical way to assess that, even though we do have a scoring mechanism internally. And that's more to really backtest our assessment later. So 10 years from now, when we'll have all the returns, we
Sure.
can say, what criteria of that entrepreneur or of that company should we have, looked at more to get more successes and reduce our failures. But that's sort of more for backtesting. In the end, we really want the whole team to like the business. And as I mentioned, we only do 3 or 4 investments a year. That at least that's the plan for the fund.
Sure.
So, most companies, and we look at about 100 deals a quarter. So that's
Wow.
400 or 500 deals a year.
That's a lot.
So that makes it, less than 1% that we actually invest in. So as you can imagine, we say a lot of no's,
Sure.
and we try to do that in a constructive way. So we do try to give very quick feedback. One thing we do different, I think, than some other folks is that we try not to waste anyone's time, ours or the entrepreneur's time.
Sure.
So we will very quickly say, this deal is not for us, and maybe quicker than other folks, because if we don't think we can get there, why spend a lot of time to do a meeting and ask for a lot of information
Makes sense.
if we're not going to get there? And so we think that's really important, and good entrepreneurs appreciate that.
Sure.
Others get frustrated, but again, we'd rather not waste anyone's time, and we'll point you in the right direction. And we do try to give constructive feedback to entrepreneurs to say, here's why we currently are not interested. It's either too early, or it's not the right sector, or we have concerns on these 3 things. But we try to give constructive feedback. And we do encourage entrepreneurs to stay in touch, because for most cases, the company's just too early.
Sure.
Not enough revenue, not enough customers. And we do want sort of regular updates, because that makes the due diligence process much easier for us, that if an entrepreneur comes and tells us, here's what I'm going to do in the next 6 months, and then we see the person execute over 6 months
Sure.
successfully, that makes it much easier for us to sort of, take that next step 6 months later. So that's a really important piece.
No, I think that's great. And I think that's really good advice just for people looking just and kind of getting actual, input from somebody like yourself who's kind of doing this stuff, right? But I do want to dive a bit deeper into kind of the IPO side of things, because you've been through it. So for people that don't know what that really means, maybe do you want to explain that quick? Because I think some people understand it at maybe such a basic level that they don't really understand what that means.
Right. So, going public is an interesting process, but it's really not selling your company. It's really just a process to list your shares on a national exchange.
Okay.
And for practical purposes, for most startups, it's going to be NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange are kind of the 2 options in the U.S. that most people are looking to go public on.
Okay.
And it does sort of create a different regulatory framework for you, because being public, you will have retail investors, and therefore there's a level of disclosure required to the public in terms of financials, quarterly reports, and those are all regulated by the SEC. And so by being a public company, you become subject to a bunch of public reporting requirements. But the process of going public is really, there's sort of a lot of technical sort of legal paperwork and technical listing requirements. But from a practical standpoint, you're really looking to create your sort of early shareholders, your public shareholders. And so generally companies might sell 10% or 20% of their shares, either new shares that the company issues or existing shares from existing shareholders that they want to sell, into this public offering. And the process with an investment bank is essentially to do a roadshow. So after months and months of sort of preparing paperwork and preparing presentations and then ultimately getting SEC approval, so you do need SEC approval to go out and market a public offering. And the SEC really doesn't do a business evaluation in terms of if this is a good or bad investment. They're really just looking that all the legal requirements have been met, all the disclosure requirements have been met, and that everything has been disclosed in the document, which is called an S1 document. And ultimately, the roadshow is sort of a 1 to 2 week process where management with investment bankers will go meet with large institutional investors like Fidelity and Wellington, and there's a bunch of, there's hundreds of institutional investors.
Sure.
To convince them to buy an amount, sort of some portion of those shares that the company is selling into the public markets.
Interesting.
And that builds your initial sort of investor roster and creates sort of float on the market, because you need to have early investors that essentially will be selling shares into the market when people want to buy them, and that creates sort of that initial float into that public market.
Got you. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. So is there, and it's probably different for every company, but do you need to be at a certain size? Do you have to have a certain revenue? What is kind of the basic guidelines before you can even start thinking to go public?
That's a very difficult question. There are certain legal requirements,
okay.
On the exchanges. So, stock exchange has requirements.
Sure.
But generally, companies will want to be significantly bigger than those requirements. So it's really driven by, does the company need access to, public capital? Is there sort of a liquidity need? Does somebody want to be able to sell their shares to other people freely? So by being public, that makes it easier for people to trade shares. It also enables employees to sort of cash in their stock options if they've got the stock options. So there's lots of reasons to want to go public. But that said, there's a lot of cost of being public. So there's administrative burden in terms of quarterly filings. There's sort of the business burden of public disclosure, which means your customers, your competitors, lots of people will be looking at your information, not for investment purposes, but for other reasons.
Sure.
And so that is a big cost to the business. So there's lots of different ways to think about it. And then there's hard costs in terms of compliance costs, to file all the papers, to do the proper internal procedures required to be public. There's insurance that can cost hundreds and thousands of dollars. So the estimated cost of being a public company is for most companies, like at my company, it was at least $1 million a year, if not more.
Wow.
In just sort of administrative and hard costs. Those are people costs, insurance costs,
sure,
filing costs, all of and legal costs. So
sure,
there's significant costs to go with that, and that has to be weighed with the benefits. So I think most companies will wait as long as they can before going public.
Okay.
And as you know, there's huge companies today that are talking about going public and still have not, and are worth tens
sure,
and tens of billions.
sure.
And the reason they don't want to disclose the information to their competitors. And that's one big reason people don't want to go public.
Got you. So what were the main reasons you guys decided to go public?
It was really from a liquidity standpoint. So we had been in business, for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
We had early shareholders who were able to sell a little bit of their shares to the private equity firm in 2008. But then in 2010, we saw an opportunity to create more liquidity for early shareholders and for Lightyear Capital, who had invested in 2008. Right. So that's one of the things. By raising money, investors want to create liquidity. And to your question earlier, investors generally can't really drive the timing or the type of exit,
right,
but can certainly sort of have a desire and encourage entrepreneurs to seek an exit at the right time. And most funds have sort of a 3 to 5 year horizon to want, to get, get an exit out of an investment.
Sure.
And it depends a little bit on when the fund invested. So most funds have a 5-year investment period and then sort of a 5-year period to sort of manage those investments and get the funds back. So if an investment was done very early in a fund life, it might be fine for it to take 7 or 8 or 9 years because it sort of, overlaps with the other investments. And that's sort of what drives some of the timing, for companies to do sort of either an M&A process and sell the company, or to do an IPO, which also creates some liquidity for shareholders.
Sure. No, that's great. So we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So maybe let's close the show with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and the company. And you're also doing a talk at the Startup Expo, correct? You maybe want to mention what you're talking about there or going to be talking about there?
Sure, absolutely. So at SupX, I'll be running a financial technology panel, and
Okay.
I think we'll be announcing the speakers shortly.
Sure.
But we're putting together a great panel talking about fintech, which is a hot area, and it's changing. So there's a lot of new things and new areas being touched on there. So that's definitely one panel I'll be doing, and I may do 1 or 2 other things as well there. So, but I'm always very active and at different events. And then more information on LaSolis Venture Capital is best to find on our website, which is lasolisvc.com. And that's the best place to read about, what we do, our portfolio, and that's also a contact link where entrepreneurs can submit their information and get in contact. And we do respond to, all messages. So we encourage folks to just, send us, a message through the website. And then one of the partners, or Nate, who's our associate, will get right back to them.
Perfect. Well, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for having me on the show.
All right. Thanks, man. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show was done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.